Hello. Just over a week ago, Israel launched Operation Rising Lion against Iran, and the crisis in the Middle East continues to escalate. So what does this mean for the war in Ukraine? Well, officials in Russia have described it as alarming and dangerous. The Russian media is doing that now as well and saying that this is a massive escalation. And there's also a concern in Kyiv that President Trump's attention is going to be drawn away from Ukraine. You remember that he left the G7 meeting in Canada early, and that's one of the questions that you've got for us today, what that could possibly mean. We've got lots of great questions and an expert panel here to answer them for you.
I'm Vitaly Shevchenko.
I'm Olga Robinson.
I'm Matthew Savill.
And I'm Lucy Hockings. Welcome to Ukrainecast.
Ukrainecast from BBC News.
Matthew, you're Director of Military Sciences at the Royal United Services Institute. It's a defence think tank based here in London. We have to assume you are really, really busy at the moment.
Indeed, yes. And we actually had a sort of a major conference with the Army on land warfare this week as well. So business as normal, as well as all of the current crises.
How much of your time is being taken up with the Middle East now?
A lot in terms of interest and what it says about the relative strength of the Israeli and Iranian armed forces, but also our colleagues who deal with nuclear issues and proliferation are obviously very interested in what it says about the state of the Iranian nuclear program.
And Olga, I'm sure you've been quite torn too in lots of different directions on BBC Verify.
Yes, my team has been juggling both Ukraine and the Middle East, but largely Middle East, Iran and Israeli strikes. And as we speak, the team is verifying material that is coming from earlier today. And it's been, it's always relentless at Verify, but honestly, it's off the scale this week.
Yeah, I can imagine. Well, let's kick off with some of the questions that you've been sending us. And a lot of you have got in touch to talk about the impact of what's happening in the Middle East on the war in Ukraine. Let's have this question first.
Hi, Ukrainecast. This is Claudia from London. I've got a question regarding the impact of the war between Iran and Israel on Ukraine. I was wondering if the potential increasing cost of gas and oil due to the war will be favorable or help Russia at all, because they make quite a lot of money by selling their hydrocarbons, and would it not be the best time now to put sanctions on any sale of gas and oil to the rest of the world? Thank you very much.
A couple of great questions there from Claudia Vitaly.
Absolutely. Russia may be saying publicly that it's very concerned about what's going on and this is a major escalation. But privately, it stands to benefit. Oil prices are rising. The last time I checked, it was 20% crude up since this started. And oil and gas and other hydrocarbons they make up more than 60% of Russia's exports, about a third of Russian state revenue. So the more money they're able to get, the better able they are to fund the war. As for new sanctions and whether this is a good time, Ukraine would argue that this is all long overdue. Why didn't the West do it before? And there's also a school of thought that the sanctions, whatever sanctions have been imposed on Russian oil and gas, they're not really working. Take the oil cap. G7 nations, they've imposed the top price that customers are allowed to pay for Russian oil, which is $60 per barrel. But that's really difficult to enforce, given how Russia's using its shadow fleet of tankers that keep changing their names, and good luck trying to prove their ownership and who runs them and who benefits from that oil. So a lot of people are saying, new sanctions, they will impact Russia's ability to wage war. But let's also try and enforce the ones that you've approved.
But also any sanctions would normally take quite a while to have some impact. And, that time might be crucial for Ukraine.
We did see, Matthew, Britain announce some new sanctions on people and groups it said were linked to Russian finance, energy and military operations. But then on the other hand, you've got President Trump at the G7 saying, he's really reluctant to impose any new sanctions.
Yes, there is a bit of an issue in that you have got this tension in terms of the US sounding like they're pretty reluctant to do more. I mean, this isn't my core field. What we do know is that there are sanctions that are in place at the moment that are not being fully implemented, and particularly ones that affect the Russian, the military industrial complex, as it's called, which is components that are being brought in, used in their weapons, where existing sanctions could actually have some impact. Although I am personally sceptical, given the record of sanctions in achieving major policy change. Like it's invariably been part of an overall campaign to create pressure, not on their own.
Well, let's delve into one of your areas of expertise, Matthew, because of course lots of people have been getting in touch with us about what's happening on the military front, defence focus questions. And one of them is Fabian, who actually joins us now from North Wales. Hi, Fabian.
Hi, Lucy. Yeah, I'm from Llanrydder in North Wales. Been following what's been going on since the beginning. One of the many questions that I've got is that I'm constantly hearing that Russia could further attack other countries within the NATO bubble. Now, I think that Russia has attacked Ukraine, which Ukraine is 28 times smaller than Russia, with the intention of taking over Ukraine within 3 days. Now, it's now been 3 years later, and Russia is struggling. It's looking for aid from Iran. They're turning to North Korea for soldiers. So what is the justification for people thinking that if Russia cannot take over a much smaller country, it's going to attack other countries within the NATO bubble, and by doing so, that would then bring the rest of NATO involved? Can this really be a justifiable fear?
Matthew.
So
it is asked all the time.
Yes. And of course, you had the NATO Secretary General the other week talking about the threat from Russia and sort of some comments about if Europe doesn't rearm, prepare to speak Russian. And frankly, that was a degree of threat inflation.
Well, it's not up to me to decide, of course, how countries pay the bill. I mean, what I know is that if we want to keep our societies safe, and look, if you do not do this, if we would not go to the 5%, including the 3.5% core defense spending, you could still have the National Health Service, or in other countries their health systems, the pension systems, etc. But you'd better learn to speak Russian. I mean, that's the consequence. When I came to NATO, people sometimes told me, yeah, but Mark, bringing these brutal facts out in the open might also rattle our populations. Yes, they'd better be rattled, because this is a reality. I mean, let's be honest. It's our task as politicians to be brutally honest how we see the facts and what is and the facts are clearly there that Russia is able, within 5 years, to mount a credible attack against NATO territory, if we do not now start to take these decisions.
It all depends on what the scenario you're thinking of. So it is absolutely true to say that Russia has struggled to conquer Ukraine. I mean, that's essentially decapitate the government and take over large parts of the country. And, you keep coming back to the heroic defence that Ukrainian forces have put up, and the international support in terms of supplies of weapons, equipment, training and intelligence that has enabled that. So, Russia surely couldn't beat NATO. That's probably not what it's trying to do. What Putin wants to do is, first of all, Ukraine, expand what he sees as Russia's sphere of influence. As far as he's concerned, Ukraine should be under Russian influence, a pro-Russian government, and not a threat. And that applies to lots of countries in Eastern Europe as well, and the Baltic states. To do that, what he essentially wants to do would be to pick them off one by one. And to do that, he fundamentally needs to fracture NATO as an alliance. So what a lot of the analysis about the Russian threat boils down to is some kind of operation, as the Russians would call it, which demonstrates that the collective defence aspects of NATO, Article 5, aren't worth the paper that they are written on, and that he can therefore nibble away at Europe or create political discord, which is what would happen if you had a successful attack. So what a lot of people are concerned about is some kind of small incursion that wouldn't receive a major response from NATO and would cause doubt amongst individual countries that other NATO countries would come to their assistance. So we aren't talking about Russian tanks driving all the way to the Channel. What we are talking about, though, is could there be some kind of activity that shows, no, other European countries or the US don't have your back?
And some would say that this has already happened. Not tanks, but shopping centres catching fire, logistics hubs somehow catching fire as well, hacking attacks that take the lights out. Supposing somebody like Hungary or Slovakia say, well, actually, we need Russian oil and gas. No, we're not happy to go along with it. So what's there to stop Russia from then running tanks across the border?
Yeah, and of course, some people will always point out that the Article 5 is a commitment to consult. It doesn't actually commit you to action, but this is how NATO deterrence holds, which is that there is this degree of ambiguity over what would result, and you don't want to take on a nuclear alliance, which is what NATO is. It is a nuclear alliance because of the members who have nuclear weapons. So the threat is that basically Russia introduces this political discord into Europe and then takes advantage.
And Olga, to Fabian's bit of the question about the strength of the Russian military as well, do they have enough resources to do that?
Yeah.
Does Matthew's scenario kind of answer that it would be small, the sort of nibbling effect that he's talking
I think
about?
if you look at the situation right now, like I struggle to see how Russia would launch effectively a second front, because if you look at the situation on the front line, the footage there is emerging all the time from the front line thanks to the many drones that are there. Russia is sustaining heavy losses, both in manpower and hardware, and that it takes its toll. And a lot of these losses are kind of hidden away from the general population, but they must be having some sort of an impact. But at the same time, the Kremlin generally tends to kind of like to keep people on their toes all the time, and they keep guessing what it is that Russia is going to do next, what country is next, and so on. So, there have been recently a few articles about the satellite imagery of like a base near on the border with Finland, where you can see some increased activities, more tents, repairs that are being done. And it doesn't necessarily point to the prospect of like an imminent attack or Russia preparing for something, but it does kind of shows a trend or the kind of way of thinking, what they're thinking. A lot of people are trying to guess what it is exactly that they're aiming for.
Fabian, does that sort of answer your question? Is this something you've been worried about for the past few years, or is it more a recent concern?
No, it's not really something I've been worried about, because I've always felt that, with the war going on, Russia isn't really strong enough to be taking these sort of measures against other countries. But just finding out now what you said, it seems as though with the bureaucracy and everyone has to be in agreement that just like the UN, NATO could also turn out to be a toothless tiger.
I'm off to the NATO conference myself next week. These questions are going to come up. We'll definitely be asking them from NATO leaders as well. But thank you for joining us from sunny Wales.
Yeah, it is very sunny as well.
Across the country today. Thanks, Fabian.
Yeah. Thanks, Fabian.
Okay, thank you.
Let's have another question now, and we've got one from Dave, and Dave is asking about the Russian economy. He says, I see stories about high interest rates and inflation, but not much about the impact it's having on the likes of consumer spending, business activity, public spending outside of defence and economic growth. How long can Russia afford to carry on its invasion, and will the economy bring about the end game?
I think there are just so many people who would want to know the answer to that question. The short answer is we don't know how long Russia will be able to carry on the invasion. And a lot of critics of the Kremlin would argue that what their hope is that one day the economy will collapse and it will eventually change the sentiment in the country, because at the moment the majority of the population is supporting the Kremlin. Now, I think it's really important to understand that I'm not an economist, but in the first 3 years of the full-scale invasion, the majority of Russians haven't really hugely felt the kind of negative impact economically of the war on themselves. In fact, quite a lot of people were better off, like contract soldiers who get significant amounts of money, and their families. And some of those people are from the regions which are not like far away from Moscow, and normally are kind of way poorer than in Moscow. And when you listen to what people say generally, when I speak to some of the family members and some of my friends back in Russia, you do hear complaints about inflation, shrinkflation, and how it's much more difficult to get the quality of the goods that they are used to. But they're not talking specifically about huge struggle economically. That might still change, because we know from estimates that the economic growth is slowing down, and that people will probably feel a bit more pressure as the war carries on. But obviously it's not happening at the moment.
Vitaly, could you explain to us the importance of the Sovereign Wealth Fund in Russia? Because we've had Kaja Kallas, who's the EU Foreign Affairs Chief, just say in the past few days, only in the month of May, it declined by $6 billion, from $42 billion to $36 billion. She says it could run out of money by next year.
We know that Russia responds to strength and nothing else. That is why we have just proposed this 18th sanctions package to pile on the pressure. Every sanction weakens Russia's ability to fight this war. Do not be fooled. Thanks to the EU sanctions, Russia has lost tens of billions of euros in oil revenues. Its sovereign wealth fund declined by 6 billion only last month. Sanctions work. In parallel, the European Union is the biggest provider of support to Ukraine.
It's the money that Russia has at its disposal to invest. But frankly, I struggle to see any reasons for the Russian economy to collapse anytime soon. As things stand at the moment, Russia is able to produce much, much more ammunition and weaponry than NATO, as you will know, Matthew. Russia's exports of, well, let's take hydrocarbons again, gas, to Europe, they're growing. They jumped by 20% last year. Half of Russia's liquefied natural gas is being sold to Europe. Then there's China, then there's India, who are more than happy to keep on buying Russian oil and gas, which gives Russia more money. So whatever's happening in the Sovereign Wealth Fund, yeah, it's part of the equation. But if we were to take a step back and look at what Russia is able to do now and how it's able to resupply its coffers with money, I wouldn't worry if I were Vladimir Putin.
Okay, let's have another question. And Matthew, this one is right up your street.
Hi, Ukrainecast. It's Mark in The Hague. Ukraine has been going after the Russian drone supply chain and hitting all kinds of industrial targets linked to production. I'm wondering how much is left. Is it actually possible to, for example, stop fibre optic drones altogether, given the amount of fibre needed? Thanks.
Thanks so much for your question, Mark. Before you answer it, what is a fibre optic drone, Matthew?
So there's been increasing use on both sides of small drones, although you might say they're missiles. Right? They're a thing that is fired and goes bang, that are controlled by fibre optic cable. And so it has a little drum attached to the drone, and it spools the cable all the way back to a controller, which is operated by a person. And these are usually these first-person view drones. So somebody is, if you like, controlling it, looking through a headset. And the reason that fibre optic cable is used, and we're talking a drum that can contain 10, 15 more kilometres worth of cable, is because then there isn't a radio control or other control signal that can be jammed or interfered with, because what had become popular was effectively jamming drones so that the controllers lost contact with them and they couldn't strike their target. And now these FPVs are everywhere. And you see these incredible images of fields that are strewn with this cable, because obviously the drone hits the target and goes bang, but there is then 20 kilometres of cable leading back to a control point somewhere in the other side.
Okay, and to Mark's question that he's got, how much damage has been done, what's left?
So this is a huge question, and it's been an expanding part of the Ukrainian campaign over probably a good 2 years now, which is to go after the Russian military industrial complex, particularly with its own long-range drone strikes, and potentially stuff that was closer that it went after with Western-supplied missiles. So going after where cruise missiles or ballistic missiles are being stored or manufactured. Some of the targets are hundreds and hundreds of kilometres away, which is why they've been increasingly expanding the range of their own drones. There's a large facility, the Alabuga Industrial Complex, I think it's called, which is where the Russians make their copy of the Iranian Shahed drone. And so not only are they attacking forces at the front line, they're trying to cut the supply of new material going to Russian forces. The big problem is that this complex is huge and expanding. So the Russians have been able to maintain production of things like Iskander ballistic missiles, KH-101 or Kinjal cruise missiles. So there has definitely been success. We've seen huge attacks that have destroyed entire facilities that mean those are weapons that never made it to the front line. But it's not really been clear if that's had an effect on essentially large Russian infantry assaults. So, yes, you can go after these things. This is also an area where sanctions would help. Lots of the fibre optic cable comes from China. I think they're one of the world's largest producers. If you applied sanctions and stopped it getting there, the Russians would have to source it from elsewhere. But what we haven't yet seen is this kind of widespread effect slowing down what in many cases amounts to a large infantry assault war.
The number of drones which Russia has been sending to attack Ukraine has been breaking record after record. Previously, you were looking at about 100 drones, give or take.
Yeah. And that would have been a big one. The average was 80, I think, drones in an
Right now, we're talking 500 a night. So all these efforts are not really working. Russia is totally capable and happy to keep making drones, deploying them, sanctions or no sanctions.
They do work from the morale perspective, though.
Yeah.
I want to squeeze in one quick question, and it's a really lovely one from Nina. Are there any current books, films, or other forms of mass media out there available in English that capture the lived experiences of Ukrainians during the war? I recently heard Oksana Maximchuk discuss her poetry book, Still City, which was so inspirational and moving. Is Oksana well known, Vitaly?
Among certain people, yes. She is Ukrainian, but I believe she lives in the States, and her poem, Still City, is her debut in English. But there's plenty others and other books you can read if you're interested in what it's like to be there. How does it feel? Serhiy Zhadan, for example, a prominent writer and musician. The Orphanage. It's a book about a Ukrainian trying to save his relative who is in an orphanage in an occupied part of Ukraine. Andriy Kurkov, who was on this podcast in 2022, I think. And he's written several books about this, available in good bookshops across the world.
Quick recommendation from you, Olga?
Well, actually, Serhiy Zhadan was one of the recommendations from my Ukrainian friend. But my personal recommendation is definitely 20 Days in Mariupol, the documentary. I think lots of people thought about it. It's a harrowing watch, but it's worth watching.
Must have been such a hard watch for you, Olga, but thank you. Thank you, Vitaly, Matthew. Good to see you as well. And thank you for watching. We'll be back with a new Q&A episode next week, but don't forget to check out our Ukrainecast feed where there is plenty more analysis for you as well. And do subscribe so you never miss an episode. Bye-bye.
Ukrainecast from BBC News.